beyond GDP, inclusive resilience, global debt, and the climate crisis. So our mission for this deep dive is to take that exact image from the cover and figure out the actual mechanics of how we got here.
Right.
It really is. We're going to unpack why our current definition of what makes a society prosperous is, well, completely broken on a mathematical level.
Yeah, mathematically broken is the perfect way to phrase it.
And we'll look at how we might have to fundamentally reinvent our entire economic civilization before the ecological and financial realities of the planet essentially force our hand.
And, setting the parameters for this discussion is crucial right up front, because when we get into the mechanics of economic systems, the instinct is almost always to retreat into traditional political tribalism. People immediately want to take a side.
Oh, for sure. It gets so polarized so fast.
Right, and we need to actively resist that today. We are not interested in political sides here. We are looking entirely at systemic structures.
Just the math, basically.
Exactly, the global mathematics that currently govern our resource distribution. And, most importantly, the raw, undeniable data of planetary limits.
Yeah.
So this is about understanding the architecture of how we live, purely through the lens of structural evidence and causality.
And I think the best starting point for that structural analysis, the text calls it the paradox of plenty.
The paradox of plenty, yes, it's a huge concept.
It really is. It's this baffling reality where on a macroeconomic spreadsheet, we literally have record global wealth. I mean, the stock market consistently tests historic highs.
Right.
We have this insane technological sophistication that allows us to sequence genomes and launch reusable rockets.
Yeah.
And yet
that aggregate abundance exists right alongside structural mass precarity.
Exactly. You have millions of people who, despite operating inside this multi-trillion-dollar machine, are just one single emergency away from total financial ruin.
It is the defining contradiction of the modern economic era. I mean, it really is. And the core argument we need to examine today is why we actually tolerate this contradiction.
Right. Why don't we see it as a massive glitch?
Why don't we immediately flag this as a catastrophic systemic failure? And the answer, according to the report, really comes down to the scoreboard we use, the metric, specifically gross domestic product, or GDP. Because for roughly 80 years, GDP has functioned as the absolute dominant metric of human civilization.
We base everything on it.
We really do. We use it to evaluate a nation's legitimacy, its creditworthiness, its global power, its modernity. But the fundamental mechanical flaw with GDP is that it only measures the absolute volume of economic activity. It is completely blind to the value, the distribution, or the actual sustainability of that activity.
Which is just wild when you think about it. Because we treat it like a definitive measure of societal health.
Right.
Like relying on GDP to gauge prosperity is basically like judging the health of a human being strictly by how many calories they consume every day.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right.
Yeah.
Because eating 10,000 calories of junk food makes the number go up, which looks like growth. But it completely ignores the fact that the body is actually collapsing from the inside out.
That is exactly how the accounting works. I mean, let's look at the mechanics of this flaw, starting with what the report calls natural capital.
Okay. Good.
So imagine you have an ancient, fully intact forest ecosystem just standing there. It provides immense structural value.
Right. Free services, essentially.
Exactly. It filters the local watershed. It sequesters massive amounts of carbon. It stabilizes the microclimate. It prevents soil erosion.
All highly valuable things.
But according to the strict rules of GDP accounting, that living forest has a value of precisely zero.
Wait, literally zero?
Literally zero. It contributes absolutely nothing to the economic scoreboard while it's alive. But the moment you introduce chainsaws, clear-cut the entire forest and GDP registers a massive spike. You have suddenly generated growth. The accounting system registers the liquidation of the asset as pure income.
Wow.
And it completely ignores the permanent long-term loss of the ecosystem services that forests provided.
And that accounting error just compounds when you look at how we measure, disaster and disease.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if a massive flood wipes out a coastal community, homes destroyed, infrastructure shattered, entire lives completely upended, the massive capital expenditure required to rebuild all of, that actually registers as a net positive on the GDP scoreboard.
Exactly. The human suffering, the destruction of existing multi-generational wealth, the psychological toll, none of that is subtracted from the ledger.
It's invisible to the math.
Totally invisible. Only the money spent on the reconstruction contractors is added. And the same perverse incentive applies to public health, too.
Right. The report talks about pollution.
Yeah, consider a heavy industrial zone that is heavily polluting the local watershed and the air supply. The local population subsequently experiences, a massive spike in chronic respiratory illnesses and cancers.
Which is horrific.
It is. But think about the economics. The resulting medical expenses, the emergency room admissions, the lifelong pharmaceuticals, the specialized care, all of those transactions contribute positively to GDP.
So the sicker the population gets, the richer the economy looks.
Exactly. You are looking at a population whose physical health is literally deteriorating, but the economic scoreboard reads it as a tremendous victory. We are systematically confusing motion with progress.
But wait, didn't the guy who actually invented GDP warn us about this exact thing? I feel like I remember reading that the creator of the metric practically begged governments not to use it this way.
You're referring to Simon Kuznets.
Yes, Kuznets.
Yeah. In 1934, when he presented the original formulation of national income to the U.S. Congress, he explicitly warned against equating this specific metric with societal welfare.
He knew it was flawed.
He did. His exact argument was that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income.
Right.
Because it was designed as a highly specialized tool during the Great Depression. It was just meant to give the government a baseline of industrial production simply to see if the factories were still running.
Just a pulse check.
Exactly. It was never, ever intended to be the permanent operating system for global civilization.
So, if Kuznets explicitly warned us, and the math is this obviously flawed, we just laid out how backwards it is, how did this specific metric calcify into a global religion?
It's a great question.
Why are we so deeply obsessed with the sheer volume of physical growth?
Well, to understand that, you have to look at the unique historical window in which this metric was actually adopted.
Okay.
Modern economic modeling emerged during the absolute peak of the industrial era, and you had a very specific temporary set of variables at play.
Like what?
First, the sudden massive introduction of cheap fossil fuels.
Right, oil and coal.
Yeah, which provided an unprecedented energy subsidy to humanity. Second, you had colonial and post-colonial extraction networks supplying a seemingly endless, artificially cheap stream of raw materials.
Because they weren't paying the true cost for them.
Exactly. And third, you had rapidly expanding populations moving into newly industrialized consumer markets.
Right, so in that specific historical context, the Earth essentially felt infinite.
It is.
The human capacity to extract resources was just tiny compared to the sheer vast size of the biosphere.
Precisely. The constraints back then weren't ecological. They were purely technological and labor-based. So in that specific era, measuring sheer physical throughput made a certain kind of sense.
Because more throughput generally did mean more actual houses, more roads, more food.
Yes. But what happened is that this temporary historical condition was basically formalized into a permanent ideology.
We got stuck in that mindset.
We completely institutionalized an obsession with physical expansion. And you see governments today continuing to legislate based on this terribly outdated assumption.
Oh, all the time.
They equate economic health almost entirely with physical construction. New mega highways, massive airport expansions, endless industrial corridors.
Even if we don't necessarily need them.
Right. They celebrate this concrete heavy growth as modernization, even when those exact projects destroy the very biodiversity that supports local agriculture, or when they lock the society into massive long-term carbon liabilities.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where we hit the absolute brick wall of reality.
Yeah.
Because the ideology assumes infinity, but the biosphere is a closed system.
It's finite.
Endless extraction is just mathematically impossible on a finite sphere. You cannot run an infinite growth paradigm on a planet with strict physical boundaries, which leads to this really fascinating concept in the report, performative prosperity.
Ah, yes. Performative prosperity.
Because when you try to force infinite growth in a finite system, you end up basically faking it.
Performative prosperity is the inevitable result of maintaining the GDP scoreboard in an era of strict ecological limits. It describes an economy that generates staggering statistical wealth, but leaves its actual participants highly vulnerable.
It looks good on paper, but feels terrible in real life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can have a nation that boasts multi-trillion-dollar corporate valuations and, record stock market highs.
Right.
But if that exact same nation has a middle class that cannot afford basic housing,
which we see everywhere right now.
if its healthcare system operates with zero surge capacity and just buckles during a localized crisis, and if its basic water infrastructure is failing due to decades of deferred maintenance.
And what does that wealth even mean?
Exactly. The wealth at the top is essentially an illusion. It is a performance, it has the aesthetic of prosperity, but it lacks any actual structural resilience. The system is incredibly brittle.
Okay, I track the logic there, absolutely.
Yes.
But I want to pose a genuine challenge here.
Yeah.
Because we have to acknowledge that this growth model did achieve things, right?
Right.
The text notes it reduced material scarcity for millions, it expanded transit, it accelerated science.
Absolutely it did.
So the issue isn't that it never worked. The issue is that it's a 20th century operating system trying to run on a stressed 21st century planet. But if we abandon GDP, if we abandon this whole growth model, how do we actually fund the massive transition we need right now?
That's the big question.
Don't we need massive economic growth just to pay for the new solar grids, the retrofitting of cities, all the advanced battery factories? Isn't growth absolutely necessary to build our way out of the climate crisis?
That is the critical distinction we have to make, and it's a very common point of friction when people debate this. We have to separate what the report calls throughput growth from capacity building.
Okay, throughput versus capacity.
Right. The industrial model we inherited achieved significant things, yes, but it did so by entirely externalizing its true costs. It treated atmospheric pollution and biosphere degradation as basically free subsidies.
Just putting it on a tab that no one thought we'd have to pay.
Exactly. Now, moving forward, we absolutely need massive capital deployment to build renewable grids and adaptive infrastructure. We have to build.
Right.
But under the current GDP model, a newly built solar grid and a newly built coal plant both just look like equal growth.
The math doesn't care about the difference.
It doesn't. So the alternative being proposed isn't to stop building entirely. The alternative is to stop measuring our success by the sheer volume of raw materials we churn through.
I see.
We need to start measuring it by whether that building actively increases our systemic resilience or whether it depletes it.
Okay, so we need highly targeted qualitative development, not just blind quantitative expansion.
Exactly.
But let's pull on that thread about capital deployment for a second. Because if actual physical growth is hitting the limits of cheap energy and raw materials like we just discussed, how are the global markets still going up?
That is the terrifying part.
Right. How are we still reporting growth quarter after quarter if the physical frontiers of the planet are closing? The mechanics behind this in the report are honestly terrifying.
We are doing it with debt.
We're doing it with debt. We are literally financing the illusion of stability.
The transition from physical expansion to financialized expansion is the defining macroeconomic shift of the last 30 years.
Financialized expansion.
Yes. Because when you can no longer generate historic growth rates through cheap extraction and expanding consumer bases, you synthesize that growth through leverage. You borrow.
And the numbers they provide on this are just staggering.
The data here is incredibly stark. By the first quarter of 2026, the ratio of global debt to GDP reached approximately 317%.
317%.
Yes. Humanity collectively owes more than 3 times the value of its entire total annual economic output.
Let's just slow down and look at the math behind that. Because 317% is a systemic anomaly.
It's unprecedented.
We have borrowed against our own future labor and the planet's future resources to such an extreme degree that we owe 3 entire years of the whole planet's production just to zero out the ledger.
Just to break even.
But obviously not all debt is exactly the same.
Yeah.
There is a mechanical difference between borrowing to build a bridge and borrowing to just inflate a stock price.
Correct. And the report is very clear on this. Productive borrowing is literally the foundation of modern civilization.
Right.
When a state takes on debt to finance durable infrastructure, high-speed rail, universal education, or renewable energy capacity, that is highly productive.
Because it pays off later.
Exactly. It generates future economic and social returns that vastly exceed the initial cost of servicing the debt.
Makes sense.
But the crisis we are in right now is driven almost entirely by destructive borrowing. A massive percentage of that 317% figure is not financing the future at all.
What they're doing.
It is financing speculation, it's driving asset inflation, it's funding corporate stock buybacks, and it's being used for endless emergency stabilization measures just to prevent the fragile system from fully seizing up.
And the mechanics of that stabilization, that's exactly what central banks have been doing for over a decade now.
Ever since 2008, really.
Right. Whenever there's a crisis, central banks use quantitative easing. They just inject massive amounts of liquidity into the financial system.
Printing money, essentially.
Yeah, they buy up government bonds and mortgage-backed securities to keep interest rates artificially low.
Mm-hmm.
But that newly created money doesn't actually flow into the real economy to build factories or raise wages.
Well, it gets trapped in the financial sector.
It flows directly into financial assets. It massively inflates the stock market, and it violently inflates real estate prices.
Right.
So the people who already own assets just see their wealth absolutely explode, while the middle class gets completely priced out of basic home ownership. We're essentially borrowing money just to maintain the illusion that the system is functioning normally.
And while that asset inflation creates deep domestic inequality in wealthier nations, the mechanics of this debt trap are absolutely devastating for the developing world.
Oh, the outward wealth transfer is brutal.
It is. When a developing nation faces climate shocks or economic instability, it almost always has to borrow in foreign currencies, typically U.S. dollars.
Okay, yes.
Now, when global interest rates rise, or when their own domestic currency depreciates against the dollar, the cost of servicing that dollar-denominated debt just skyrockets.
So they are completely trapped in a vice.
They are.
They have to allocate massive portions of their entire national budget just to pay the interest to foreign bondholders.
Exactly. Money that desperately needs to be spent domestically on climate adaptation, on building flood walls, on upgrading fragile energy grids, or on basic public health is instead just siphoned right out of the country to service sovereign debt.
The massive drain.
And to generate the foreign currency needed just to pay those minimum debts, these nations are often forced to accelerate the liquidation of their own natural resources.
Oh, man. So they have to cut down more trees.
Right. They have to clear cut more forests for export agriculture or drastically ramp up mining. They end up further degrading their own ecological resilience just to keep up with the interest payments. It is a structural mechanism that actively prevents them from building resilience.
I mean, think about what that actually means on the ground for a second. If you're listening to this globally, if an entire nation is drowning in sovereign debt, they literally cannot afford to adapt to a warming planet.
They are structurally prohibited from surviving.
Structurally prohibited. That is a terrifying phrase. And this is exactly why the source insists that you cannot separate finance from ecology. The climate crisis and the global debt crisis are literally the exact same conversation.
They are completely intertwined.
Because if a country owes 150% of its GDP to foreign creditors, telling them to simply, quote-unquote, transition to green energy is deeply cynical. They don't have the liquidity to do it.
No, they don't. A meaningful transition requires upfront capital. Without fundamentally restructuring the global sovereign debt architecture, we're talking about serious debt jubilees or massive debt for nature. Swaps any international rhetoric about sustainability is entirely symbolic.
It's just talk. And because these developing nations are financially trapped and cannot build adapted infrastructure, the ecological instability they're facing isn't staying contained.
Nature doesn't care about borders.
Exactly. It is spilling over everywhere. Which brings us to a really fascinating breakdown of the geopolitical labels we've used for half a century.
The old binary of developed versus developing nations.
Right.
It was always a bit of an economic oversimplification, but under current planetary limits, it is becoming entirely obsolete.
The lines are just blurring completely.
Because climate disruption does not recognize sovereign borders, and it certainly does not care about a nation's GDP.
Not at all.
The underlying assumption was always that wealthy nations could simply buy their way out of ecological consequences, that their advanced infrastructure would perfectly buffer them. But the recent data completely shatters that illusion.
We're seeing it in real time, constantly. You look at incredibly wealthy regions dealing with complete systemic failure.
Right.
Like multi-billion-dollar power grids in places like Texas completely collapsing under anomalous winter storms.
Yeah.
Massive, historic flooding, literally wiping out advanced infrastructure in Western Europe. Heat domes melting transit cables in the Pacific Northwest. The sheer kinetic energy of the disrupted climate is just overwhelming systems that were designed for a 20th century baseline that simply no longer exists.
And that leads to this powerful phrase in the report. We are all developing countries now.
I love that phrasing.
It captures the paradigm shift perfectly.
Right.
Because no nation on Earth currently possesses infrastructure that is fully capable of withstanding the level of ecological volatility that is already locked into the atmospheric system.
We're all behind the curve.
Exactly. Therefore, the new developmental metric is no longer about reaching a certain threshold of consumer throughput. The challenge for every single nation, regardless of its current wealth, is building adaptive capability under conditions of extreme stress.
It really requires a massive psychological pivot. I mean, it's like realizing you're on a sinking ship, but you spent the last hour just bragging about having a first-class ticket.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. The water doesn't care what class you're in. The ship is going down.
The water's rising for everyone.
Exactly. And surviving this requires shifting from short-term optimization, worrying about quarterly earnings or the next 2-year election cycle, to deep intergenerational planning.
Which is very hard for our current systems to do.
Very hard. But how do you actually do that? Because if the old labels are dead and literally everyone's infrastructure is vulnerable, you can't just pass a single carbon tax or tweak a few regulations and expect it to fix the problem.
No, incremental tweaks are over.
You have to rewrite the foundational code of civilization.
The conclusion the report draws here is that incremental policy adjustments are structurally insufficient at this stage. You cannot solve a systemic interconnected crisis with isolated policies.
Right.
For instance, passing an environmental protection law is largely futile if the broader architecture of your legal and economic system actively rewards ecological depletion.
Wait, break that down for me.
Sure. Think about the codes governing corporate finance, international trade, tax incentives, infrastructure investment. If those foundational rules prioritize short-term extraction, the broader system will simply override any isolated environmental regulation you try to put in place.
Okay, let's look at the actual mechanics of that root legislation, because it affects everything we do daily.
It really does.
Take urban zoning laws, for example. In many parts of the world, zoning legally mandates sprawling, low-density suburbs that are completely separated from commercial centers.
Which forces everyone to drive everywhere.
Exactly. That isn't just a random aesthetic choice. It is a literal legal framework that dictates transportation dependency. By law, you are forcing the population to own vehicles and burn fossil fuels simply to acquire basic food.
Right.
You can incentivize electric vehicles all you want with tax credits, but the root legislation still mandates massive energy consumption just for basic human mobility.
Or consider the mechanics of agricultural subsidies. In many advanced economies, the state provides massive, multi-billion-dollar financial subsidies for industrial monoculture.
Just growing corn and soy as far as the eye can see.
Growing single crops on a massive scale using incredibly heavy chemical inputs. This depletes the topsoil, it destroys local watersheds, and it relies heavily on fossil fuel-derived fertilizers.
Right.
Now, the farmer isn't doing this because they actively want to destroy the soil. They're doing it because the root legislation makes it the only economically viable path for them to survive.
We're just following the incentives.
Exactly. The report has a key takeaway here. If laws reward depletion, depletion becomes rational behavior.
Man, and that goes all the way up to corporate governance, too.
Oh, especially corporate governance.
Like the concept of fiduciary duty, right?
Yeah.
As it's currently interpreted in many jurisdictions, it legally compels corporate boards to maximize short-term shareholder returns above almost all other considerations.
Yes, it is codified into law.
So if a CEO decides to take a short-term profit hit to fundamentally decarbonize their supply chain for the long-term good, they can literally be sued by their own shareholders for breaching their fiduciary duty.
They will be removed.
The law essentially requires them to act like a sociopath.
Exactly. The architecture of our legislation shapes human and corporate behavior. We cannot expect participants in the market to voluntarily act against their own economic survival within the current rules of the game.
Right, you have to change the rules.
If the foundational rules allow for the externalization of long-term costs, then destruction will continue to be highly profitable. To change the outcome, you have to change the legal definition of fiduciary duty itself to include stakeholder resilience and ecological viability.
But I have to push back here.
Please do.
Because rewriting the core legal definitions of corporate finance, urban zoning, and agricultural subsidies on a global scale, that sounds incredibly, almost impossibly utopian.
It sounds massive.
Right. Getting a single basic infrastructure bill passed takes years of grueling political gridlock. Critics will look at this dossier and say it's a lovely thought experiment, but it is completely detached from the political realities of how the world actually works. How does the source address that pushback?
That is the standard counterargument, absolutely. But we have to fundamentally evaluate what the word unrealistic actually means in this context.
Okay.
The underlying assumption behind that criticism is that the current status quo is stable and that it can be maintained indefinitely if we just keep tweaking it.
Right, that things will just sort of carry on.
But the physical data dictates otherwise. Maintaining a civilization designed around exponential extraction on a rapidly destabilizing finite planet is what is actually the ultimate utopian fantasy.
So the status quo is the fantasy.
Exactly. The belief that we can simply keep operating the 20th century model without catastrophic supply chain failures, massive ecological blowback, and societal collapse that is profoundly delusional.
Wow. Okay, so the choice isn't between maintaining a comfortable normal status quo versus attempting some difficult utopian transition.
No.
The actual choice is between proactive, intentional redesign of our systems or having a chaotic, catastrophic redesign violently imposed upon us by the physics of the planet.
Precisely. The planet will balance its own ledger. That is physics.
It doesn't care about our politics.
The question is merely whether humanity will dictate the terms of that balancing, or whether we will simply suffer the blunt consequences of it.
But let's bring this down from the macro level of global legislation to the actual human beings who have to live through this transition.
The sociological side.
Right, because you cannot mobilize a society to rewrite its foundational code if the population is completely burned out, fractured, and deeply cynical.
No, you can't.
Which brings us to the psychological toll of that paradox of plenty we started with. The human element here is just as critical as the financial modeling.
Economic design absolutely cannot be separated from sociology. The structural inequality we discussed earlier generates profound, measurable social feedback loops.
And what's the most destructive one?
One of the most destructive is the perception of selective justice. When an economic system is heavily financialized, you inevitably see the unequal application of laws based on wealth, corporate influence, and social status.
And to be clear to the listener, we are looking at this purely as a sociological phenomenon. We aren't taking sides.
Exactly, just observing the mechanics.
But when a population observes that a massive financial institution can engage in reckless systemic fraud, totally crash the economy, and just pay a fractional fine without anyone going to prison.
While a regular citizen faces devastating legal consequences for a minor infraction.
Right. When that disparity is obvious, the social contract just completely breaks.
It does. Because trust is the invisible infrastructure of any functional society.
Oh, I like that. Invisible infrastructure.
When institutions are perceived as fundamentally unfair, when there is an obvious structural disparity in how rules are enforced, that trust completely evaporates.
You just vanish.
And the cascade effect of that erosion is incredibly dangerous. Civic participation drops, political polarization intensifies, and conspiracy thinking finds highly fertile ground.
Because people feel like the game is rigged.
Exactly. From a sociological perspective, this is entirely predictable. If people believe the game is rigged, they stop trusting the referees. They stop trusting the institutions that distribute information, manage public health, or coordinate climate responses.
You just can't coordinate anything.
You cannot build systemic resilience in a society that has fractured into cynical, distrustful factions.
It completely paralyzes the society's ability to act collectively. And it's really compounded by the mental toll of the economic precarity itself. The report goes into this deeply researched concept regarding the narrowing of mental bandwidth.
Yes, the scarcity mindset.
Right. When a human being is forced to live in a constant state of scarcity, whether that's stressing about missing a rent payment, drowning in medical debt, or facing food insecurity, their actual cognitive processing changes.
The psychology of scarcity is a critical factor here. When you are under chronic financial or existential threat, your brain biologically shifts into short-term survival mode.
Just fight or flight.
Exactly. It narrows your focus exclusively to the immediate threat. You simply do not have the cognitive surplus, the mental bandwidth, to engage with complex intergenerational problems like decarbonization or structural legal reform.
You literally can't think about 2050 when you're worried about Tuesday.
Fear and stress entirely dictate decision-making under those conditions.
It's a bandwidth tax. You can't ask someone to care deeply about the long-term viability of a local watershed if they are terrified about how they're going to keep the lights on next week.
It's impossible.
So, if precarity destroys our ability to plan, how do we break the cycle? Like, what does this all mean for us? How do we build the psychological endurance needed to actually push for these massive structural changes? Because reading this, it feels overwhelming.
It is overwhelming, and this is where the concept of autosuggestion and narrative framing becomes a structural tool rather than just some self-help cliche.
Autosuggestion, like internal narratives.
Yes. In the face of systemic crises, there is a very strong tendency towards fatalism.
Oh, definitely. Doomerism.
The belief that the system is too big, the collapse is totally inevitable, and individual agency is meaningless. Cultivating a positive internal narrative, both individually and collectively, is not about toxic positivity or ignoring the data.
It's not sticking your head in the sand.
No, it is about preserving agency.
It's the difference between acknowledging the severe danger and just completely surrendering to it.
Exactly. Communities that actively reinforce the narrative that they possess inherent dignity, that they are capable of collective action, and that a fairer system is structurally possible. They behave entirely differently from communities that succumb to doom.
They actually fight for reform.
Psychological resilience is the absolute prerequisite for social mobilization. You need a population that fundamentally believes the future is worth the agonizing friction of transition, because the transition will have friction.
And because that transition is so difficult and rewriting the laws requires so much sustained human effort, we constantly look for shortcuts.
We love a silver bullet.
We really do. We look for a savior that doesn't require us to fundamentally change our behavior. And the two biggest false saviors we constantly point to are technology and the free market.
Yes. The tech fixes.
People say, don't worry, AI will fix the climate and carbon pricing will fix the economy. We really need to dissect the mechanics of why the report issues a firm warning that this is a dangerous fantasy.
Technology is frequently framed as an independent force that will inherently bend towards solutions. The technology is fundamentally agnostic.
It doesn't care.
It doesn't. It merely amplifies the incentives of the political economy it currently operates within. Now, the analysis here does not dismiss technological innovation. In fact, it highlights its absolute necessity.
Right, we need the tech.
We do. For example, precision agriculture utilizes advanced sensors and satellite data to drastically reduce the water and chemical fertilizers needed for crop yields.
Which is amazing.
It is. Artificial intelligence can process vast climatic data sets to optimize global shipping routes or manage decentralized renewable energy grids with incredible efficiency. Fintech platforms can bypass traditional predatory banking structures to offer microinsurance to vulnerable farmers in the global south.
Those are incredible tools. But they're just tools. And the report brings up how they are subject to the Jevons paradox.
Yes, the Jevons paradox is key here.
Explain that for the listener, because if you make a system more efficient, but you are still operating under the ideology of infinite growth, you don't actually reduce your resource consumption, right?
Correct. You just use the newly gained efficiency to expand even further and extract even more.
So efficiency just breeds more consumption.
Precisely. If highly advanced AI systems are entirely controlled by concentrated corporate monopolies whose strict legal fiduciary duty is to maximize short-term profit, those systems will not be deployed to build inclusive resilience.
No, they'll just be used to make more money.
They will be deployed to optimize algorithmic trading, to create hyper-addictive consumer interfaces, to automate mass surveillance, and to further fragment the labor market into highly precarious gig work.
It just accelerates the broken system.
The central issue is not the technical capability of the technology, it is the ownership and the incentive structure governing its deployment.
The tool is neutral, but the hand that wields it is driven by the GDP scoreboard.
Exactly.
And we see this exact same dynamic when we try to use market tools to solve the climate crisis. Let's look at the mechanics of carbon markets and carbon credits, because this is perhaps the greatest example of performative prosperity we have right now.
It's a massive issue.
The theory sounds great, right? Put a price on carbon, let the free market figure out the most efficient way to reduce it. But the reality outlined in the dossier is basically a masterclass in greenwashing.
What's fascinating here is the mechanical flaw in many carbon offset markets. It lies largely in the concepts of additionality and baseline manipulation.
Additionality, what does that actually mean?
Okay, so when a massive corporation purchases a carbon credit to offset its emissions, it is essentially paying for an environmental project somewhere else, like paying to protect a forest from being logged.
Okay, sounds good in theory.
However, Mathematically proving additionality is incredibly difficult. You have to definitively prove that the forest was actually going to be cut down if the credit wasn't purchased.
Oh, I see.
Often, project developers manipulate the baseline. They claim a forest was under severe, immediate threat when it really wasn't, thereby generating phantom credits that represent absolutely no actual reduction in atmospheric carbon.
It's just a pure accounting trick.
Yeah.
A fossil fuel company can announce they are quote-unquote net zero while continuing to extract and burn the exact same amount of oil simply because they purchased millions of these phantom credits.
Which do nothing for the atmosphere.
It's literally like paying someone else to go on a diet for you while you keep sitting there eating the junk food and then wondering why your own personal health is failing.
That is the perfect analogy.
Right, because market tools can support a transition, but they cannot substitute for actual systemic change.
And beyond the accounting fraud, there is a much deeper philosophical failure here. The carbon offset model treats ecological stability as a transactional mechanism, a commodity.
Commodity to be traded.
It reinforces the mindset that environmental destruction is perfectly acceptable, provided you can just afford the financial fee to externalize the guilt. It commodifies the biosphere, rather than treating it as a non-negotiable structural boundary. You cannot solve a crisis caused by the over-financialization of nature by creating a new, highly complex financial derivative based on nature.
You can't just buy an indulgence and outtrade physics.
You really can't.
Market mechanisms can help facilitate a transition, but they cannot replace the actual physical work of redesigning our systems. We still actually have to stop burning the fuel. We still have to change the zoning laws. We still have to rewrite the corporate charters.
The physical work remains.
Which brings us finally to the alternative. Because if GDP is a fatal accounting error, if debt is a trap, and if tech and markets are just tools waiting for direction, what is the new metric?
This is the core proposal of the report.
What is the actual structural goal of a sane civilization according to this deep dive?
The new paradigm proposed here is called inclusive resilience.
Inclusive resilience.
This is the specific framework that must replace throughput growth. It completely changes the foundational questions we ask to determine if a society is successful.
Okay, so what are the new questions?
Instead of asking, do we maximize the volume of transactions this quarter? We must ask, are ordinary people buffered against disruption?
Right.
Do our ecosystems remain functional? And do we have adaptive capacity?
And that inclusive part of the term is critical because it actively asks, does this resilience extend to the broader population, or is it exclusively concentrated among the hyper-wealthy?
Exactly.
Because a society where billionaires can build self-sustaining high-tech bunkers in New Zealand, while the public grid completely collapses for everyone else that is not resilient, it is deeply, deeply fragile.
It is the definition of fragility. Inclusive resilience fundamentally redefines the utility of our everyday infrastructure.
Give me an example of how that shifts our perspective.
Well, under a strict GDP framework, public transportation is evaluated purely as a financial asset.
Does it make money?
Exactly. Does fare revenue cover operational costs? If not, it is deemed a financial failure and its budget is cut.
Right, which happens constantly.
But under inclusive resilience, robust public transportation is evaluated as a critical adaptive mechanism. It ensures that the labor force can remain mobile and the local economy can continue to function even during severe global fuel shortages or major price shocks.
It provides actual systemic stability.
Exactly. It changes how we view everything. Universal healthcare ceases to be viewed merely as a massive drain on the national budget and is instead recognized as the ultimate baseline of adaptive capacity.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
If a new pandemic or a massive prolonged heat wave hits, a population with universal access to preventative care and zero fear of medical bankruptcy will weather that shock infinitely better than a population actively avoiding the doctor because they simply can't afford the copay.
Right. And public health is public resilience.
Yes. Affordable housing becomes a way to eliminate the massive systemic vulnerability of mass homelessness during extreme weather events.
Even things like ecological restoration are fundamentally recontextualized here.
Absolutely.
Like restoring wetlands or reforesting watersheds is no longer treated as just a charitable, aesthetic, environmental expense. It is recognized as critical, high-return economic stabilization.
Because a restored wetland provides vastly superior, much cheaper flood mitigation than constantly rebuilding concrete seawalls that inevitably crack and fail anyway.
Right. Nature literally does it better and cheaper if we let it. It makes so much sense when you lay out the mechanics like this. But I have to say, for anyone listening, this sheer scale of change can feel totally paralyzing.
It is a massive shift.
It implies that almost every single system we interact with, from our transit to our jobs to our hospitals, has to be completely re-engineered. But I think we need to look at history here, because the current economic paradigm feels like a law of nature, but it really isn't, is it?
No, and that is perhaps the most vital historical context to remember when reading this report. Economic systems are incredibly malleable constructs.
They are invented.
They are not physical laws like gravity or thermodynamics. They change. I mean, the feudal system of land ownership and inherited aristocracy felt entirely permanent and divinely ordained to the people living inside it.
Right up until it didn't.
Right up until the merchant class and the Industrial Revolution rendered it completely obsolete.
Yes.
The immense global architecture of formal colonialism collapsed rapidly in the mid-20th century. The post-war welfare state, with its massive expansions of labor rights and social safety nets, emerged almost overnight in historical terms.
Driven by the sheer necessity of stabilizing societies after total war.
Exactly. We invent the rules, which means we can change the rules. We are simply standing at the precipice of another inevitable historical transition point. The transition feels radical to us only because we have completely normalized a system that is actively destroying its own host.
We've normalized the abnormal.
We have. The converging crises we are witnessing today, the destabilization of the biosphere, the massive expansion of unpayable sovereign debt, the fracturing of civic trust, they are not separate, random events.
They are all linked.
They are the highly predictable symptoms of a single operating system hitting its absolute mathematical and physical limits. The overarching conclusion of the dossier is not a question of whether our global economic architecture will transform.
It's happening regardless.
The physics of a finite planet guarantee that transformation is imminent. The only choice humanity actually possesses is the nature of that transformation.
Will it be managed or chaotic?
Exactly. Will it be a managed, intentional redesign based on inclusive resilience, or will it be a chaotic, violent collapse imposed upon us by physical reality?
It's basically about taking the steering wheel before the car goes completely off the cliff.
That's the choice we have.
Well, I want to thank you for breaking down the mechanics of this incredibly complex, vital deep dive today. We've traced the accounting errors of GDP, we've unpacked the terrifying global debt trap, dismantled the illusions of carbon markets, and looked at what a truly resilient society actually looks like.
It's been a great discussion.